This is video number 4 on the topic of evolution and cancer and health. Here you can learn about me, how I have handled and am handling being diagnosed with a brain tumour, and my discoveries about cancer specifically and health in general. My name is Peter Beaton, and I believe that if you're not willing to teach yourself and learn about your own body and your own health, then maybe no one can really help you. But if you are willing to teach yourself and learn about your own body and your own health, then no one can stop you. In my opinion, the basics of how to have a truly healthy diet, one that will help protect you against cancer in the first place, or if you or a loved one already has cancer, may help you or them to deal more effectively with it. This diet has to respect evolutionary principles. Our DNA, which is the operating system of our bodies, determines almost everything about who we are and how we react to the environment in which we find ourselves. It is said, and it is undoubtedly true, that nothing in biology makes sense except when viewed in the light of evolution. Evolution has shaped precisely and exquisitely how our DNA works. The role of our DNA is to turn all external sources of energy into us. Firstly, by building us in the first place from conception into adulthood, then having us reproduce an offspring that is in itself able to survive and grow into adulthood and create their own reproductively capable offspring. And then our DNA continues to maintain us for as long as possible until the being that we are generates over time until death. These external sources of energy for our DNA to work with are electromagnetic radiation, for example, visible light, but also infrared and ultraviolet and the whole of the rest of the electromagnetic radiation spectrum of which we're unaware, and water and gases, vitamins and nutrients from plants, animals, the soil and rocks and rivers and lakes, gravity, heat, cold, light and dark, magnetic forces, basically anything that makes up the physical world around us, whether we happen to be aware of it or not. These things may be abundant or scarce. We may have to have lots of certain things and avoid certain other things. And the quantity of these things can and do change all the time. So our DNA must be able to adapt to these changes. So that is our DNA, which is shaped completely by evolution. Understanding evolution is, in my view, the greatest ever achievement of human science in the field of natural history and will not, in my opinion, ever be equalled. Evolution is commonly thought of as survival of the fittest, which is true as far as it goes, but misses out on the subtleties and nuances of what evolution actually is. Without getting into the weeds too far, in terms of how DNA works, the process of evolution works mostly at the level of the creation and growing of children or the offspring or whatever the young of a particular species is called. One of the main subtleties of evolution is that the DNA that builds our bodies is capable of copying itself, almost, but not quite, perfectly, time after time after time. This copying, almost, but not quite perfectly, happens all the time in cells throughout any organism, but it is in the reproductive process, the creation of the next generation, that evolution shapes the future. The two main types of reproduction are cloning and sexual reproduction. Cloning tends to be restricted to single-celled organisms. Their tiny environmental conditions are more likely to remain constant over many, many generations. Bigger, multicellular organisms tend to be faced with more changeable environmental conditions over their generational timescales. They generally live much longer and create new generations much less frequently. In cloning, for example, that's how bacteria reproduce. A successful adult, i.e. they successfully survived to be an adult in the first place, creates an almost completely identical version of itself. After all, if the first adult had successful DNA to build it, the same DNA is very likely to be successful all over again. So, copy, paste, success. Remember though that the copy-paste process isn't 100% accurate. It is nearly 100% accurate, but not entirely. There is a tiny percentage that is copied in a flawed way or is otherwise not quite the same as the original. This might be due to some interference by electromagnetic radiation or some other outside factor, but nevertheless, the offspring has DNA that is nearly, but not quite, completely identical to the parent. This tiny flaw may have a disastrous effect and stops the offspring from surviving or from reproducing, and so the flaw will not continue to future generations. Or this flaw might be considerably beneficial, leading to a much higher likelihood of the offspring surviving and reproducing. Therefore, the flaw will probably be passed on to future generations. Or sometimes the flaw will be basically neutral, neither offering a particular survival benefit or drawback. It will probably be passed on to future generations and might, in some generation in the future, prove to be particularly useful when some unexpected or sudden change in environmental conditions happens. So, in effect, the flaw helps the DNA line as a whole to continue. Or conversely, the flaw might be particularly poor at enabling the future organism to survive this future environmental change, and so then the flaw gets removed from the DNA line. The disadvantage of natural cloning is that the entire population has a DNA sequence that is almost, but not quite, completely identical amongst the entire population. If there is some sudden environmental change that the DNA sequence cannot survive in, then the whole population may well die off. But there are those tiny, random flaws in the DNA sequence, maybe even in just one individual, and this could be just enough to turn disaster into success, i.e., the DNA that builds that one particular organism just manages to survive and reproduce when all the rest of the population has died off. So then the tiny flaw is reproduced in almost every future new offspring, because all the rest died off, and the future generations thus have DNA that can survive in this new environmental condition. This is the basis of antibiotic resistance. Sexual reproduction starts from a different premise. Rather than saying, here's a successful adult, let's try and reproduce it identically because the identical offspring will probably also be successful. The starting premise is, it's an uncertain world out there, full of changes and dangers, and there is a scarcity of resources. So let's start with a successful female adult and mix her DNA with that from a successful male adult to produce an offspring that has a random combination of both their successful DNA lines. The resultant offspring might not be so guaranteed to be successful as cloning if the environmental conditions are identical, but in a changing environmental condition, at least some of the offspring are likely to have a surviving DNA combination. Oh, and the process isn't 100% perfect again. Therefore, there will be a tiny proportion of mutations which neither the successful female or the successful male had originally, and which may or may not be beneficial to the survival and reproductive ability of the new offspring. As in cloning, if the random mutation is not beneficial, the new organism created will not survive, the DNA will not be reproduced, and will not form part of the DNA of future generations. If the mutation is neutral or advantageous, it will go on to form part of the DNA of future generations. Therefore, any sudden change in environmental conditions is very unlikely to wipe out all the population due to the subtly variable population of DNA sequences that the overall population is made up of. and the wild cards of the mutation might just, very occasionally, give an extra edge for survival. Adding on top of all that is the fact that these potential changes in DNA occur at the level of every single gene that the organism possesses. Humans have approximately 30,000 genes that make up our being, and this process occurs in every gene at every new conception. In the real world, at the scale that humans live, environmental conditions often, but not always, happen gradually. So different DNA sequences in individuals can have a marginal effect on the likelihood that an individual will survive, and if so, is marginally more likely to produce a viable offspring which can find itself a male or female to reproduce successfully with. So the DNA sequences generally change to the marginally more successful ones slowly, over many generations. But in the end, this is the most robust, most successful DNA sequence, most exquisitely refined to turn all of the energy of the environment into a successful, healthy, viable new offspring that can itself successfully grow into a healthy adult that will be capable of reproducing to form a next new generation, and so on. So that's a very basic, brief idea of what evolution is. If we think of human evolution, we need to appreciate both evolution itself and also climate change. We are in the midst of an ice age called the Holocene Ice Age, which began 3 or 4 million years ago. At that time, before this ice age began, most of Africa was a hot tropical rainforest, and our distant evolutionary ancestors, called hominids, were tree-dwelling, fruit-eating, ape-like creatures. As the air dried, more and more water was being locked up in ice sheets, and the temperatures cooled slowly at the beginning of the Holocene Ice Age, the rainforests retreated. Rainforests like hot, wet conditions. The trees began to get spaced out, so that our ancestors had to evolve their feet from tree climbing to walking, from tree to tree, looking for food, rather than just swinging over to the next nearby tree. As all plant life retreated somewhat, there was not enough nutrition available from plant food to compensate for the effort of walking from one tree to the next, since the trees and plants were becoming more and more widely separated. Some of our ancestors found they could get nutrition from the carcasses of dead animals. This scavenged meat was nutritionally much denser, pound for pound, than fruits and leaves and bark. In an environment which was beginning to be characterized by scarcity, this was a huge survival advantage. The population thus evolved into one that could survive and thrive on meat, which took way less time and energy and effort to obtain in proportion to the energy and nutritional rewards it provided. And thus we evolved into a more upright, walking and more meat-eating species. The ability to survive on scavenged meat evolved into a requirement to actively kill for meat. Thus evolved the ability to throw efficiently. Humans are the only throwing animal, which, combined with our ability to walk and thus to jog and to run, led to the evolution of basic endurance hunting. We humans were never the fastest creatures, but we are very efficient at keeping cool during the day, due in part to our more and more upright gait, and also the evolution of sweat glands. Even in an ice age, summers in Africa were still high in ultraviolet light, clouds were more scarce because water was locked up in ice sheets, and relatively warm. So humans could track larger animals which could run away initially pretty quickly, but had to eventually stop and cool down and rest. Humans could keep going all day, like in the tortoise and hare story. Eventually, we could run the prey animal into exhaustion and kill it by throwing rocks at it. This new, relatively easy access to nutritionally dense meat meant that humans slowly evolved to have larger brains to outwit their prey and to cooperate with other humans in the hunting process. However, larger brains are very energy hungry, and the restrictions of evolution, i.e., you actually have to find and harvest all the energy that your body requires, means that if the body that your DNA builds cannot be supported by the energy from the surroundings, you will not survive or thrive or reproduce. So the extra energy demands from our increasing brain size were counterbalanced by a reduction in demand for energy-intensive gut tissue. Since plant food requires a much large colon in order to break down plant materials and extract the energy and nutrition that it contains. So we humans traded larger brains for smaller guts, in both cases because we were eating more and more meat in our diet. Contrast Homo sapiens with modern gorillas. A gorilla's DNA creates a massive and strong animal using plant food, but the gorilla is dependent on eating for a large proportion of the day. Naturally occurring plant-based food is nutritionally less dense than meat, so a lot more of actual plant food needs to be consumed, which simply just takes time. And the gorillas have small brains compared to the Homo sapiens, and they have huge, large colons compared to Homo sapiens, which is a requirement for extracting sufficient energy and nutrients from the initially nutritionally less dense plant food. Gorillas' ancestors never traded bigger brains for smaller guts. They evolved in the rainforests that survived the Ice Age in South America and never had to leave the trees to find food and nutrition elsewhere like Homo sapiens ancestors had to. Evolution never stops, i.e., the requirement to be highly efficient in harvesting the nutrition and energy that our bodies require, not only to survive but to thrive and reproduce from the environment in which we find ourselves in, never ends. So, the increasing meat in our diet allowed for further increases in brain size, leading to the development of both cooperative hunting and hunting with weapons, and the use of fire by about 2 million years ago. These new evolutionarily honed traits slowly led to the evolution of modern Homo sapiens about 100,000 years ago. The Homo sapien is obviously the peak of human development, and the diet that got us here was almost exclusively meat. Fruit was eaten in season to put on body fat for the approaching winter. Ice Age Africa had definite winters, unlike today. Nuts would also have been eaten in season. Any human colonies near rivers, lakes, or the ocean consumed a lot of their meat in the form of seafood. Vegetables, i.e. plants, were mostly a source of ancient medicines, but the poisonous nature of most plant leaves meant that the few plant-based foods that were palatable, mainly root vegetables, were fallback, emergency, subsistence foods. As the Earth entered into our recent warming phase of this current Holocene Ice Age about 12,000 years ago, the Homo sapiens species was at its evolutionary and health peak. Any weakling that could not maintain perfect health on fresh fat, meat and water was bred out. The new warming trend led to the development of modern agriculture and the reliance on grain products as a staple of diet. This was the beginning of modern diseases like heart disease, arthritis, dental disease, cancer, and many other conditions that we are familiar with today. There are some people who will not accept that humans evolved principally because we are top-line carnivores. Top-line carnivore means that not only did our ancestors eat herbivores, such as cows are today, but we also ate other carnivorous hunters, like, for example, jackals or their ancestors. These people maintain their lack of acceptance despite the multitude of evidence lines, all from different sources, which all tell the same story of humans developing because we became mostly meat eaters. Any research science that can gather evidence from all sorts of different types of techniques and different sources of evidence is all the stronger and more reliable for it. We can do stable isotope analysis of ancient bones and fossils, which can determine the kinds of foods eaten by the owners of those bones when they were alive. We can analyse the characteristics of teeth in the jaws of ancient fossils. We can analyse weapons found in ancient human settlements. We can analyse ancient human skeletons for signs of inflammation and damage. We can analyse the ancient skeletons of animals found within ancient human settlements for butchery marks. We can see early Homo sapiens society reflected in the artwork of cave paintings from 20 to 30,000 years ago depicting group hunting. There are no cave paintings of anyone tending to vegetables. All these different types of evidence and more, gathered over what now amounts to centuries by all sorts of different researchers in all sorts of different fields of research, all point independently to exactly the same conclusion. Homo sapiens evolved because we ate mostly meat. There are studies of more recent human remains that date from earlier within our present warming period, which began 11 or 12,000 years ago. For example, two groups of racially identical people living quite near to each other in what is now the USA, but separated by maybe 1,000 years. Both of these groups lived many centuries before Christ. And the groups were separated by lifestyle. One group was a heavily meat-based society, and one group was a heavily plant-based society. And the studies and the comparisons show that the plant-based humans had lots of tooth decay, of heart disease, of bone diseases, etc., etc., and cancer, never found in older skeletons from before the current warming period, whilst the meat-based societies' human skeletons had only trace amounts of all of these health afflictions. Studies of ancient Egyptian mummies are pretty common. Very detailed analysis, including MRI scans, can be done, and the mummification process itself preserves a lot of soft tissue to this day. Ancient Egypt was a grain-based society, both for everyday nutrition for both rich and poor alike, and as a source of their wealth and power, just for the rich. All these studies show that obesity was common in these ancient Egyptians. Heart disease was common, along with bone diseases, and there's even evidence of cancers and other diseases often thought to be modern. It turns out that, in terms of the link between diet and health, the term modern means the last 12,000 years since the beginning of this present warming phase of this current Holocene Ice Age, and therefore with the development of agriculture, particularly grain-based agriculture. In the late 19th and early 20th century, there were lots of published studies carried out by Western medical professionals and researchers that compared the health of societies that were still living traditional, non-westernized lifestyles, where they ate mostly meat, where they hunted for themselves, for example, Eskimos who hunt seals and whales, Native Americans who hunted bison, South Sea Islanders who ate a fish and shellfish-based diet, etc. Compared them to the so-called modern societies that the doctors and researchers came from. And one universal finding from all these studies was that cancer was so rare as to be almost unknown in the traditional societies. Whereas, by the late 19th and early 20th century, the rising rate of all cancers in all Western societies was being widely recognized and debated. Most of the things wrong with human health today can be traced back to ignoring the lessons of evolution. If we consider our actual day-to-day diet, what we actually have on our plates every day, in the light of the question, would our ancestors of 50,000 years ago, in the middle of an ice age, recognize this food? If we ask that question, we'll be going a long, long way towards fixing our own personal health. No need to ask your doctor, no need to ask a dietitian, no need to look it up on the internet, just ask that question about everything that you eat and drink. If we eat and drink only the food and drink that has shaped our evolution and thus fueled the most healthy ever version of ourselves, then our own health and well-being are as close to being guaranteed as it is possible to get. If you or a loved one has cancer, then I know exactly how you feel. I'm not a doctor, I'm not giving medical advice. I am simply sharing knowledge that I believe can help you know and understand that there are lots of practical things that you can do for yourself or your loved one to help deal with this thing over and above what the mainstream medical system can offer. Hope is not a strategy, but learning, researching, actively helping yourself and not just taking even a doctor's advice without critically thinking about it for yourself certainly is a strategy. If you want to do one further thing to help you understand evolution, read Climbing Mount Improbable, a book by Richard Dawkins. If you want a brief but better overview of our own Homo sapiens evolution, look up on YouTube Dr. Michael Eades plus evolution. That's Eades spelled E-A-D-E-S. It will bring up a video from the Low Carb Denver conference in 2020, which lays out all of the evidence in an easy to understand way.